The silver platters felt like lead weights against my palms, but I moved through the grand pavilion like a shadow, weaving between the silk-draped bodies of Harbor City's elite. The ballroom was a symphony of excess. The sharp clink of gold-rimmed flutes, the dizzying scent of expensive gardenias, and the low, constant hum of people who had never known the meaning of the word no. I stepped to the side as a group of socialites passed, my spine pressed against a cold marble pillar. In this world, I wasn't Violet Harper, mother of two. I was just a black-and-white uniform with a tray. "Sparkling water, miss," a man snapped, not looking up from his phone as he swiped a glass. I offered a practiced, empty smile that he didn't bother to catch. 3 years of this had taught me that to the wealthy, a waitress is just part of the architecture. My lower back throbbed, a dull reminder that I was 10 hours into a double shift. I'd taken the overtime because my twins, Maya and Eva, needed new winter coats, and the landlord at our complex didn't accept "I'm tired" as a form of currency. Every time my muscles screamed, I pictured their sleeping faces at my neighbor's apartment, and I kept moving. I was clearing an empty table near the towering French doors when I saw her. She was tucked away in a velvet alcove, far from the spinning couples on the dance floor. While the rest of the room was a blur of motion, the little girl was a statue of perfect, agonizing stillness. She wore a dress of red lace that looked like it cost more than my car, but her small hands were gripped tight around the edge of her chair. She wasn't watching the party. She was staring at a single, stray pearl bead that had fallen onto the tablecloth, her brow furrowed in a trance-like state of focus. In a room of 500 people, she was the loneliest thing I had ever seen. "Violet, stop daydreaming and hit the West Wing with the appetizers," my manager, Marcus, barked as he swept past. I straightened my apron, but my eyes lingered on the girl. A group of laughing men stood barely 3 feet from her, their loud voices making her flinch, yet not one of them offered her a glance or a smile. She was a ghost in a lilac dress. Then, the air in the room didn't just change, it curdled. The laughter near the entrance died a sudden, jagged death. A path cleared through the crowd as if sliced by a blade. I looked up and felt the oxygen leave my lungs. He didn't walk, he prowled. Dmitry Sokolov was a silhouette of sharp charcoal wool and lethal intent. He was broader than any man in the room, his face a mask of cold, Slavic bronze, and eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world and hadn't been impressed. Behind him, 2 shadows in heavy overcoats followed, their hands hovering near their belts. This was the man mothers whispered about to make their children behave. The Sokolov scourge. The man who owned the docks, the dirt, and the politicians of this city. He ignored the trembling hands offered to him, his gaze locked on the far corner of the room. As he approached the alcove, I saw the transformation. The predatory tightness in his jaw eased, replaced by a look of raw, terrifying devotion. He reached the girl, Anastasia, and placed a massive, scarred hand near her shoulder, careful not to touch her yet. The most dangerous man in the city leaned down, his voice a low rumble I could feel in my own chest. The girl didn't look up from her pearl, but her tiny shoulders finally dropped an inch. I should have walked away. I should have gone to the kitchen. But as I watched them, I saw Anastasia reach for a small piece of fruit from a nearby plate, and that's when the rhythmic, silent life of the gala turned into a countdown for a tragedy. Before we continue, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So, let me know where you are listening from. Let's continue. The shift in the room was instantaneous, a chilling transition from the hum of polite conversation to a vacuum of pure, suffocating silence. It started at the table in the alcove. Anastasia, who had been so still just moments before, suddenly jerked upright. Her small hand flew to her throat, her eyes widening into orbs of sheer panic as she tried to draw a breath that wouldn't come. The sound she made was a wet, desperate wheeze, a struggle for life that cut through the ballroom's opulence like a jagged blade. I dropped my tray. The sound of shattering glass was like a starter pistol, but no one ran to help. Instead, I watched in nauseating disbelief as the elite of Harbor City did the unthinkable. The woman in emeralds, who had been laughing seconds ago, took a deliberate step backward, her face paling not with sympathy, but with terror. A senator I recognized from the news adjusted his tie and turned his back, shuffling away as if proximity to the crisis was a death sentence. They weren't afraid of the girl dying, they were afraid of the man standing over her. Dmitry Sokolov was frozen, a mountain of granite paralyzed by a monster he couldn't shoot or bribe. His large hands hovered over Anastasia, trembling with a rare, frantic helplessness. He looked around the room, his dark eyes screaming for a doctor, a miracle, anything, but the sea of designer gowns continued to part, creating a wide, cowardly circle of empty space. To them, Anastasia wasn't a child in need, she was a ticking bomb, and to interfere with the Sokolov bloodline was to invite a darkness none of them were brave enough to face. The girl's face was turning a terrifying shade of dusky blue. She began to thrash, her movements uncoordinated and frantic, her sensory-overloaded brain colliding with the physical agony of the obstruction. "Help her!" Dimitri's voice finally broke, a guttural roar that vibrated the very floorboards. "Someone help her!" Still, the millionaires and icons of industry remained rooted to the spot, their eyes darting toward the exits. They watched the Mafia princess fade with the same detached horror one might feel watching a car wreck from a safe distance. I didn't think about my job. I didn't think about the black SUVs or the weapons hidden under tailored jackets. I only thought of Maya and Eva and the terrifying reality that if this were them, these people would let them fade into the carpet just to keep their own hands clean. I broke the invisible line. I sprinted past the paralyzed waiter and dived into the circle of cowardice, my sneakers squeaking against the polished floor as I reached the girl whose life was slipping away in a room full of people too rich to care. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't wait for the security detail to clear a path. I shoved through a pair of billionaires who were more concerned with wine stains than the dying child, and I slammed my knees onto the marble floor beside the girl. The scent of her expensive perfume was choked out by the sharp, metallic smell of sheer panic. Anastasia's face was a haunting shade of indigo, her small fingers clawing at the air as her body began to go limp. "Move," I hissed, my voice cracking through the hollow silence of the room. Dmitry Sokolov loomed over me like a thundercloud, his face a mask of jagged, murderous desperation. For a split second, his massive hand twitched as if to strike me away, his protective instincts warring with his terrifying helplessness. But he saw the clarity in my eyes, the mother fear that matched his own, and he stepped back, a low, guttural sound escaping his throat. I grabbed Anastasia, hauling her small, trembling frame up and spinning her around. She was lightweight, almost fragile, and her sensory-overloaded mind was still fighting the world even as it ran out of air. I wrapped my arms around her waist, fisted my hand just above her navel, and delivered a sharp, upward thrust. Nothing. I did it again, harder this time, ignoring the terrifying creak of her expensive lace dress. "Come on, baby," I whispered against her hair. "Breathe for me." On the third thrust, a piece of hard candy flew from her lips, skittering across the pristine marble like a discarded marble. The sound that followed was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard, a ragged, gasping sob as air finally rushed back into her lungs. Anastasia collapsed back against my chest, her small body heaving with violent, rhythmic tremors as she began to cry, a high-pitched, keening sound that signaled she was back. The room remained frozen, a gallery of statues watching the waitress and the Mafia princess. I stayed there on the floor, cradling her, my chin resting on the top of her head as I smoothed her hair, murmuring the same nonsense words I used for my twins when they had nightmares. Slowly, I looked up. Dmitri was standing inches away. Up close, he was even more terrifying, a man built for war, now vibrating with the aftershocks of a near loss. His dark, lethal gaze dropped to his daughter, then slowly rose to mine. There was no gratitude in his expression yet, only a soul-stripping intensity that felt like a physical weight. His eyes, cold as a Siberian winter, scanned my face, my cheap uniform, and the name tag pinned to my chest. He looked at me not as a servant, but as the woman who had just reached into the jaws of death and snatched his world back. In that look, I knew my life as an invisible waitress had ended. I had saved the daughter of a monster, and the monster was never going to let me go. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the rest of the gala finally curdled into a cold, hollow ache by the time I reached my neighborhood. It was 3 a.m., and the streetlights of the Lower East Side flickered with a tired, jaundiced yellow. My feet felt like they had been marched over broken glass, and my hands still carried the ghost weight of Anastasia's small, shaking body. I just wanted to climb into bed, pull the thin quilt over my head, and pretend that the look in Dmitri Sokolov's eyes hadn't changed the molecular structure of my air. I turned the corner onto my block, my keys already clenched in my trembling hand, but I stopped dead. The crumbling brick of my apartment building was illuminated by the predatory glow of high-end LED headlights. 3 black SUVs, polished to a mirror finish that looked obscene against the backdrop of rusted fire escapes and overflowing trash cans, sat idling at the curb. They were positioned with military precision, flanking the entrance to my building like iron sentries. My heart didn't just beat, it thrashed against my ribs. I thought of Maya and Eva asleep upstairs with my neighbor, Mrs. Gable. I thought of the bloodstained thank you the city whispered about, how the Sokolovs paid their debts in either gold or lead, and usually, the latter came with a message. One of the heavy doors creaked open, and a man stepped out. It wasn't Dmitri, but his shadow, the man from the gala with the stone-cold face and the bulge of a holster clearly visible under his dark overcoat. He didn't move toward me. He simply stood there, his breath frosting in the biting night air, watching me with the detached observation of a shark. The silence of the street was absolute, save for the low, rhythmic growl of the idling engines. I realized then that my invisibility hadn't just been stripped away. It had been incinerated. I was no longer the waitress who could hide in the kitchen. I was the woman who had touched the untouchable, and the world I lived in, the world of rent deadlines and cramped studio apartments, was now colliding with a world that didn't recognize boundaries. I took a shaky step forward, my eyes darting to the third-floor window where my daughter slept. The man moved then, reaching into his pocket. I braced myself, my lungs seizing, but he didn't pull a weapon. Instead, he held out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. The paper was thick, embossed with a crest I didn't need to read to recognize. "Mr. Sokolov does not like to be kept waiting, Miss Harper," he said, his voice as flat as a tombstone. The SUVs didn't move. They weren't there to deliver a letter. They were there to wait for an answer. As I took the envelope, the sheer weight of it told me everything I needed to know. The gala was over, but the dance was just beginning, and this time, I didn't have a tray to hide behind. The cream-colored envelope felt heavy, like a lead weight in my hand, as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. Inside was a single card with an address embossed in black ink and a time, 7 o'clock. No request, no RSVP, just a destination. I spent the next several hours in a state of vibrating anxiety, checking on Maya and Eva every 10 minutes as they slept, their small, rhythmic breaths the only thing keeping me grounded. I tried to convince myself I could just stay inside, bolt the door, and return to the safety of my invisibility, But the memory of those black SUVs idling at the curb told me that the door to my old life had been kicked off its hinges. When 7 o'clock approached, the same man from the night before was waiting. He didn't knock. He simply stood by the open door of the vehicle, a silent extension of the car itself. I kissed my daughters goodbye, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and stepped into the plush, leather-scented interior. We drove in a silence so thick it felt pressurized, leaving the cracked pavement and neon signs of my neighborhood behind for the iron gates and winding, tree-lined drives of the hills. The Sokolov Manor was a fortress of glass and cold stone, perched on a cliffside like a predator watching the city below. As I was led through the towering front doors, the sheer scale of the wealth was suffocating. It wasn't the loud, desperate gold of the Gala. It was quiet, ancient, and dangerous. I was ushered into a dining room where a table long enough for 20 sat set for only 2. Dmitri was already there, standing by a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. He had traded his formal tuxedo for a charcoal sweater that made him look less like a businessman and more like the soldier he was rumored to be. He didn't turn around immediately, his silhouette framed by the distant, twinkling lights of the harbor he controlled. "You have a habit of disappearing, Violet Harper," he said, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that seemed to vibrate the air around me. He finally turned, his gaze sweeping over me with the same terrifying intensity one remembered from the ballroom floor. There was no warmth in his expression, but the lethal edge of his stare had been replaced by a piercing curiosity. "I have a job," I managed to say, my voice sounding small and fragile in the vast room. "And 2 daughters who need me home." Dmitri walked toward me, his movements fluid and predatory. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough for me to smell the faint scent of cedar and expensive tobacco. "Last night, the world watched my daughter struggle for air and did nothing. You, a woman with everything to lose and no reason to care, broke the circle." He gestured toward the chair at the head of the table. "Tonight, you are not a waitress. You are my guest. And we are going to discuss why you are the only person Anastasia has asked for since she woke up." The silence of the Sokolov estate was different from the silence of the Gala. It didn't feel like cowardice. It felt like a held breath. Dmitri led me down a corridor lined with tall, arched windows that overlooked a garden cloaked in midnight shadows. The air here was cool and smelled faintly of floor wax and old books, a stark contrast to the heated, crowded ballroom where I had first seen his daughter. We reached a set of double doors at the end of the wing, guarded by another man who stepped aside with a curt, respectful nod the moment Dmitri approached. Inside, the room was a masterpiece of soft textures and muted colors, clearly designed to be a sanctuary from the harsh, jarring world outside. Anastasia was sitting in the center of a wide canopy bed, surrounded by a fortress of stuffed animals and leather-bound books. She looked small, painfully so, against the backdrop of such immense wealth. Her governess, a woman with graying hair and a face etched with exhausted frustration, stood by the window, wringing her hands. "She hasn't made a sound since the hospital cleared her," Dmitri murmured, his voice dropping to a low, jagged frequency. "She won't eat. She won't look at the doctors. She won't even look at me." I felt the weight of his desperation. It was the plea of a man who could conquer cities, but was powerless against the wall his own child had built around herself. I took a tentative step forward, my sensible waitress shoes sinking into the thick carpet. The governess tried to speak, but Dmitri silenced her with a sharp, fractional movement of his hand. I sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to crowd her. Anastasia's gaze remained fixed on the hem of her sleeve, her fingers rhythmically plucking at a loose thread. She was vibrating with a silent, internal tension that I recognized instantly. It was the same look Maya got when the world became too loud, too bright, too much. "Anastasia," I said softly, not reaching for her, but letting my voice settle into the quiet space between us. It's Violet. I brought something. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a smooth, polished stone I'd picked up from the driveway, a simple piece of quartz that caught the lamplight. I placed it on the duvet, a few inches from her hand. For a long minute, nothing happened. The air in the room grew heavy with Dimitri's bated breath. Then, slowly, the girl's hand stopped its frantic plucking. Her fingers crept toward the stone, tracing its cool surface. She lifted her head, her dark eyes finding mine with a piercing, lucent clarity. "The light," she whispered, her voice rusty and thin, but undeniably there. "It was blue. Then you came." The governess gasped, and I heard the soft thud of Dimitri's shoulder hitting the doorframe as the tension left his body. Anastasia didn't look at them. She moved closer to me, her small frame leaning into my side, as if seeking the only anchor she trusted in a world that had tried to swallow her whole. In that moment, the glass cage didn't shatter, but the door had swung open, and I realized with a sinking heart that I was the only one holding the key. I stayed with Anastasia long after the governess had retreated and the heavy silence of the mansion had settled into the bones of the night. Dimitri remained by the door, a silent, watchful sentinel, but my focus was entirely on the girl. She had begun to line up her stuffed animals along the edge of the duvet, her movements precise and rhythmic. Each toy had to be exactly 1 inch apart, their faces turned toward the window at a specific angle. If one slipped, a soft, frustrated whimper escaped her throat, and her small hands would tremble until the order was restored. Watching her, a sharp ache of recognition bloomed in my chest. It was like looking into a mirror of my own living room back in the city. I saw the same intense, narrow focus I had seen in Maya when she was overwhelmed by the hum of the refrigerator, and the same desperate need for a predictable world that I navigated every day with Eva. The world saw a difficult or broken child of a monster. I saw a little girl drowning in a sensory tidal wave that she didn't have the tools to swim through. "The lights in the ballroom," I murmured, my voice barely a breath. "They were too loud, weren't they?" Anastasia paused, a velvet rabbit clutched in her hand. She didn't look at me, but her head tilted slightly toward my voice. "The buzzing," she whispered. "The diamonds made a noise like bees." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I know. My daughter, Maya, says the same thing about the fluorescent lights at the grocery store. She says they sound like screaming." At the mention of my daughter, I felt Dimitri's gaze sharpen. He moved closer, the shadow of his large frame falling across the bed. I didn't pull away. I realized then that the opulent glass cage he had built for Anastasia was part of the problem. It was too sterile, too quiet, and yet filled with the high-frequency tension of a father's fear. She didn't need a fortress, she needed a bridge. I reached out and gently adjusted the last stuffed animal in the line, ensuring it was perfectly aligned with the others. Anastasia watched my hand, her breathing evening out. She wasn't just a Mafia princess or a pawn in a dangerous game. She was a soul that required a specific kind of language, one I had been speaking in the dark of my own apartment for years. I looked up at Dimitri, seeing the flicker of raw, unvarnished hope behind his lethal mask. He was a man who could command armies, but he was lost in the face of his daughter's silence. For the first time, I didn't just see the monster of Harbor City. I saw a father who was terrified of losing his child's heart, and I realized that my own struggle as a mother had been the training ground for the impossible task he was about to ask of me. The moon had climbed higher, casting long, silver bars across the library where Dimitri had led me after Anastasia finally drifted into a peaceful sleep. The room was a cathedral of dark wood and leather, smelling of ancient paper and the sharp, clean scent of the scotch he poured into 2 heavy crystal tumblers. He didn't offer me a drink, he simply handed it to me, his fingers brushing mine with a heat that made my breath hitch. He walked to a large portrait draped in shadow, a woman with Anastasia's eyes and a smile that looked like it had been stolen from a dream. Her mother, Elena, was the only peace I ever knew, Dmitri said, his voice dropping to a hollow, haunting vibration. When the explosion took her, it didn't just take my wife. It took the light from this house. Anastasia was 3. She didn't cry. She just stopped. The doctors called it trauma, then they called it a spectrum, but I saw it for what it was. She was retreating into a world where nothing could ever hurt her again. He turned away from the portrait, the amber liquid in his glass catching the firelight. The ruthless monster of Harbor City looked smaller in the dim light, his shoulders bowed under a weight that had nothing to do with his empire. I have spent millions trying to find a way back into her world. I have hired the best minds from Moscow to New York, and all they did was try to fix her as if she were a broken watch. But you didn't try to fix her. You just sat with her in the dark. He stepped into my personal space, his presence overwhelming, a mixture of raw power and naked vulnerability. The world thinks I am a man of unlimited resources, Violet. But I am a man who is failing his only child. Every day I see her drifting further away, and every day I feel the debt I owe her mother growing heavier. He set his glass down on a mahogany desk with a decisive click. I don't just owe you for saving her life at that gala. I owe you for the sound of her voice tonight. It is a debt I cannot repay with a check or an envelope of cash. I looked into those dark, bottomless eyes and saw the desperation of a father who would burn the entire city to the ground just to keep his daughter's spirit from flickering out. He wasn't asking me to be a servant anymore. He was asking me to be the anchor. You asked me earlier why I did it, I whispered, the scotch warming my throat. I did it because she's a little girl who is scared. I didn't know who you were. And now that you do? Dmitri asked, taking a final step forward until the heat of his body was a physical force against mine. Now, I said, my heart hammering a frantic, undeniable rhythm, I realized that the monster is just as afraid as the rest of us. The peace of the manor didn't break with a bang, but with a sudden, unnatural silence. The low hum of the estate's security system died, and the outdoor floodlights that had been bathing the gardens in artificial day flickered and went out, plunging the world into a thick, suffocating ink. I was in the upstairs playroom, the twins having joined us earlier that evening. Maya and Eva were sprawled on the rug, coloring in rhythmic harmony with Anastasia, who was meticulously organizing her colored pencils by shade. Then, the first concussive thud rattled the heavy glass of the balcony doors. Violet. Dimitri's voice came through the intercom, strained and tight with a lethal urgency I'd never heard. The basement vault. Now. Don't stop for anything. The sound of distant gunfire, muffled pops like bubble wrap, began to echo from the front gates. My maternal instincts, forged in the rough neighborhoods of the city, snapped into a cold, sharp focus. I didn't scream. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the emergency bag I'd learned to keep near the door and knelt beside the 3 girls. New game, I said, my voice a forced anchor of calm even as my heart hammered against my ribs. The floor is lava, and we have to be as quiet as little mice to win. Maya, take Eva's hand. Anastasia, you take mine. We're going to the secret castle. Anastasia froze, her eyes widening as the sensory intrusion of the distant alarms began to wail. She started to rock, her breath hitching in a way that signaled an impending meltdown. I knew if she spiraled now, we were dead. I leaned in close, my forehead touching hers, blocking out the shadows dancing on the walls. Focus on the stone, Anastasia. The blue light. I am your light right now. Follow me. She blinked, her small fingers digging into my palm, and she nodded once. We moved through the darkened corridors, a fragile chain of lives. I could hear boots hitting the marble floors downstairs, heavy, tactical, and not Dimitri's. The smell of smoke began to drift up the vents. Every time the twins whimpered, I squeezed their hands, my eyes scanning the darkness for the infrared sights of the men who had come to settle a debt with the Sokolov name. We reached the heavy steel door of the reinforced cellar just as a shadow rounded the corner of the hallway. I didn't look back to see if it was a friend or a monster. I shoved the girls inside, pulled the heavy lever, and collapsed against the cold metal as the locks whirred into place. In the dim emergency glow of the vault, I gathered all three of them into my arms. Anastasia pressed her face into my neck, while my twins clung to my waist. I was a waitress, a mother, and now a shield standing between the world's most dangerous men and the three innocent souls they viewed as collateral. I stayed there in the dark, a silent prayer on my lips, ready to become the monster myself if that door so much as creaked. The heavy steel door of the vault didn't open until the sun had begun to bleed gold over the Atlantic. When the tumblers finally whirred and the seal broke, it wasn't a monster standing there, but Dmitri. He was covered in the dust of the breach, his knuckles split and his charcoal sweater ruined, but the look in his eyes when he saw the four of us huddled together, my twins tucked under my arms and Anastasia asleep with her head in my lap, was something I would never forget. It was the look of a man who had finally found something worth the war he waged every day. In the weeks that followed, the cramped studio apartment and the grease-stained waitress uniform became ghosts of a previous life. My transition into the Sokolov world wasn't marked by a crown, but by a series of quiet, permanent shifts. The black SUVs no longer sat outside my door. They were parked in the driveway of the estate where Maya and Eva now ran through the gardens, their laughter blending with Anastasia's soft, melodic hum. I stood on the balcony of the West Wing, dressed in silk that felt like a second skin, watching as Dmitri sat on the grass with the three girls. He was showing them how to track the flight of a hawk, his movements patient and grounded. I had traded the safety of my invisibility for a position at the center of a storm, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the wind. Dmitri looked up, catching my gaze, and the silent communication between us felt more solid than any contract. He had given me a life where my daughters would never know the cold of a dark apartment, and in return, I had given him the bridge to his daughter's soul. I was no longer the woman carrying the tray. I was the woman who held the keys to the castle. The elite of harbor cities still whispered, their terror now mixed with a frantic, desperate respect whenever I entered a room. They saw the waitress queen who had tamed the monster, but they didn't understand the truth. I hadn't tamed him. I had simply recognized the father behind the predator. As Anastasia looked up from the grass and waved a small, steady hand at me, I realized that the glass cage was gone. In its place was a kingdom built on the only currency that mattered, the fierce, uncompromising protection of a mother's heart and a father's debt. I turned back toward the room, leaving the ghost of the waitress behind, and stepped fully into the light of the Sokolov name. Thank you for watching till the end. Your time means a lot to us. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You are valued here. See you in the next video.